Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today? We've got the aftermath of the Hollywood election still continuing. Boris Johnson and Europe, and an ill-advised reference to Hitler. Ken McCaskill's book about Lockerbie, and the Eurovision Song Contest. Too late for most of the papers this morning, but Ukraine delivered a bloody nose to Russia. So lots to talk about.
We've got some great guests as well with us today. We have journalist and commentator Ruth Wishart and stand-up comedian Patrick Rolink joining us for the newspaper review. Blair Jenkins is going to be joining us for a chat about the BBC White Paper and what it does or does not mean for Scotland. And we'll have music from Ewan McIlvanney, as well as our return from our repeat guest, David Pratt, talking today about Syria and Iraq.
So, a great show coming up. How's your week been, Michelle?
It's been good. The sunshine has been fantastic.
Been
I think we've had our summer.
But
R.I.P. Summer 2016.
This, I think, is the last day of summer.
Probably.
Indeed.
Better make the most of it.
Indeed, yes.
How was your week?
Why we're in the basement here. Yes, my week was good. A bit of a come down for me. I had a great week previously where I've actually joined the Glasgow School of Art Choir, and we had a gig last week.
Get you?
I know it. It's amazing. The funniest thing about it is I can't actually sing. So the Glasgow School of Art Choir is full of brilliant singers, and me.
And you?
Yes. We had a gig last week supporting a band called New International at St Luke's, which is just next to the Barrowlands, and it was fantastic. I mean, I was dreading it.
Did you get stage fright?
No, I didn't actually. I was fantastic. After
You were so cool with it.
No, I wasn't cool with that at all. But after it, I mean, I was like wanting to kick the band off the stage. They were the main event of the night and say, "No, this is our stage. We were here first." But it was great. It was brilliant. This week, reality returned, and I went back for another singing lesson, and my teacher nearly cried. I think last week I hit maybe 4 notes right. This week
in the right order.
Well, pretty much. This week, no.
Oh.
Hail.
Back to the grindstone next week.
Indeed. So, paper review.
Paper review, yes. Okay. Welcome, Ruth and Patrick.
Hello.
Good to have you here.
Hi.
You wanted to talk first of all about Boris and Hitler.
Absolutely. Boris Johnson suggesting that people have tried to unite Europe before, and he mentioned Napoleon and Hitler. And although he was good enough to admit that the way in which they went about things is slightly different from modern times.
Slightly. Yeah.
Just slightly. But the end result was the same, and it always ends in tragedy. Do you think that's an accurate summary of modern history?
It's a depressingly accurate summary of it. I mean, he's all over the Telegraph, as you might imagine, as he gets shed loads of money for the Telegraph for being Boris.
Yes.
I think he's kind of, with this nonsense, this latest nonsense, he's kind of morphing into a kind of Odetonian Donald Trump, which is quite a scary thought.
Yes.
So he's obviously intellectually gifted. Whether or not he's politically gifted is quite another matter. I think that particular analogy is just, completely over the top. I was thinking this morning, if being over the top was an Olympic event, he'd have more gold medals than he'd know what to do with.
Indeed. Patrick, what do you think? I mean, we've seen more recently other politicians allude to Hitler, and it didn't end very well for them.
No, it didn't. I think the difference is, though, that for some reason the mainstream media seem to have some sort of affection for Boris Johnson, and they portray him as cuddly and, it's just Boris saying things like that. And it really worries me the way the media can do that with people who express those type of views. I think in Scotland we've got Ruth Davidson, who comes across as caring, sharing Ruth, when in fact she endorses policies that are quite vile to a lot of Scottish people. And I think underneath Boris there is a layer that people will never get to see, because I think, and I may be wrong, but the mainstream media seem to protect him in some way with this cuddly image and the big dafty. But I think it's quite worrying that someone would actually think on that level. What I do hope is there's a lot of scrutiny of those remarks, and more importantly, the intent behind the remarks.
But he gets away with, this last week, before this latest outburst, this last week he was interviewed by John Humphreys, who's by common consent not a bad interviewer, and he managed to get through 15 minutes with Humphreys without answering a single question. He got through it on just sheer bluster. And he's very good at that, and he's also very good and charismatic in front of a crowd. And that's the real difficulty with somebody like Boris, because nobody really interrogates the kind of things you're talking about, Patrick. He gets away with murder, literally.
Yeah, I literally see him in the back of a bus, not in Glasgow, on Channel 4 News. And he was proud of the fact that for 15 minutes he stonewalled the question. And
do you know that battle bus was made in Germany, by the way?
Really? Probably by Nigel Farage's relatives,
Just possibly.
To protect us against possible legal action, okay, I just point out we're not actually suggesting Boris Johnson has killed somebody and committed murder.
No,
not quite
no.
literally.
Journalistic murder.
Right, okay, thank you for that.
He's killed the truth on numerous occasions.
Phew.
I think he's got all the qualities to be Prime Minister.
Let me...
We've got one. No, well, let's not go there. Yeah.
Let me do the unthinkable and suggest that there is something in what he says when he says that there is nothing about Europe that inspires loyalty. There isn't a narrative to which we can rally around and say, Europe, we love Europe because blah.
Well,
is that true?
I can rally around Europe and do, because most specifically I think the whole social chapter side of Europe, the human rights legislation, all of that, we are a better nation, we're a better collection of nations for being members of the European Union than we would have been outside of it. Of course, a lot of it's a bureaucratic nightmare, and of course things like the common agricultural policy badly need reform, but that's a million miles away from saying that if we left Europe we'd be in better shape. Clearly we wouldn't.
Yeah, but Greece isn't happy about Europe.
No, and I can understand why, but from a personal perspective, my big issue with the European debate is it's become about your Farage and your Cameron and about your Johnson. But for me, it's about ordinary working people on the street. I mean, doing what I do for a living, it's hard to make a living. And a few months ago, I took a part-time temporary job as a delivery driver, and it was minimum wage, and I had to work Saturday mornings. And I think there's people doing this week in, week out for the rest of their lives, and the only protection they've got is laws that Europe support and endorse in the UK and in Scotland. And I think employers would take advantage if we left Europe, and it would be the old argument, we need to make profits, so we need to pay less, forget the paternity leave, forget holiday pay, all these things. So as a working man, I think Europe is vital. I have my doubts after what happened to Greece and over Portugal, but I'm now swaying towards voting yes, simply because there is so little protection for the working person in the UK at the moment, and there would be even less if we left Europe.
As a working woman, the real tragedy for me is finding myself in the same corner as David Cameron and George Osborne. That's really quite distressing, but I'm going to have to stick with it.
Yeah. There's all sorts of ideas. Ian Duncan Smith talking about social injustices. You know, this is a man who would have taken a job at a poorhouse and took it with relish.
Well, there was a great poster, which sadly was just a poster online. It wasn't. I don't think it's been utilised, but it should have been saying, good reasons for staying in Europe, and all it did was give you a picture of Ian Duncan Smith, of Nigel Farage, of Michael Gove. I thought that's the way to go. Just remind people who'd be in charge if we left.
Yeah, I think if you judge people by the company they keep, you certainly wouldn't want to be in the Brexit campaign.
Although one of the successes of the Leave campaign is to portray the stay side as being the establishment, and therefore if you're rebellious or you want to be a bit edgy, the stance to take is get out there.
Well, you're going to be talking to Blair Jenkins in a little while, and Blair knows better than anybody else how Project Fear works. And they are running that playbook all over again, and they have to say they're doing it very well, and they did it very well the last time. But sadly, as I say, I seem to be on the side of the guys who used to have the black hats on.
I know, and are now doing Project Fear all over again. That suggests that if you leave Europe, it's going to be such a catastrophe that we're going to get the Third World War is going to erupt within days. And I think hyperbole like that makes it more difficult.
Can I just say again, from a personal perspective, my wife's name is Svetlana Anatolyevna Vinogradova. She's from Moscow. I'm married to a Russian, and I'm amazed at how scared the Russians are of the West at the moment. They're absolutely terrified that we're trying to impose our values on them, and they've got their issues with Putin. But I just think there's a whole
that nice cuddly Democrat, Mr. Putin.
Absolutely. But would they do any less than Boris Johnson would do? I don't really know. But I would say this. My wife is starting to feel the pressure with a foreign accent of people talking about foreigners coming to this country's immigration. She's a nursery nurse and she's been here for 25 years, but she's now been made to feel like a foreigner in Scotland through this European debate, which for me is quite frankly wrong.
From Boris Johnson versus David Cameron to another battle between Alex Salmond and Tony Blair in the Sunday Herald today. The story is that Alex Salmond is wanting to be new efforts to impeach Tony Blair over Iraq after the publication of the Shillcott report. Is this something that you think is going to ever happen?
No, I don't actually. I'm not holding my breath. Well, one thing, Alex says in the paper this morning that he thinks one of the routes to go down would be the International Criminal Court. Now, first of all, that's arguable whether that's logistically feasible in this case in terms of the evidence. But secondly, anything that's gone through the International Criminal Court takes, years upon years upon years, and by that time Mr. Blair will be getting his Euro pension.
By that time we might
because-
actually have the Chilcot report.
Well, the Chilcot report's
No.
coming out. Chilcot report is coming out very shortly, but I don't know if there's anything in it, or anything indeed in what Alex saying this morning that's new. I mean, we knew. I think it's now common knowledge that Tony Blair did a deal with George Bush, saying, "I'm with you, pal," a year before we went into Iraq. It's common knowledge that the sexed up document on weapons of mass destruction was a sexed up document. I can't think quite what else we can pin him on that isn't already in the public domain.
Do you think that Tony Blair is guilty of a war crime?
I certainly do, and the international court aspect is one that I think we have to look at, and I think being part of a wider Europe's important in the aspects of this, because personally, as someone who wants an independent Scotland, I can see justice never happening through the Union. And when you look at things like Chilcot, Guildford, Birmingham, Hillsborough, the Savile cover-up, for me the British establishment has got a tremendous record of throwing a blanket of support around its own. And there's no doubt for me that Tony Blair is now part of the establishment. And I think, to throw in a wee side issue, Fred de Fred, I mean, there was no way Fred was going to be ever taken to court, because he would have taken down more people than the Titanic. So he was protected by that. And I think the only way you're ever going to get to the bottom of what really happens is by taking things outside the British establishment. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't have much optimism for that happening, but I certainly think Tony Blair's got a lot to answer for, and I personally don't know how he can sleep at night.
I guess the question is that the Sunday Herald story is that how much new is in it, because a lot, as you say, we know a lot about this.
Well,
Again, the
yeah.
new thing is, I guess, the Chilcot report's coming out, and that AXAM thinks that as a result of this report coming out, that increases his chances of getting Blair
Well,
impeached.
Well, he may be right, and Richard, and he's certainly a lot closer to that, all of that, than I'll ever be. But let's bear in mind that one of the reasons for the Chilcot report taking, longer than the war, was because that all the lawyers of all the people involved in the report have been crawling over it for months and years. So I can't imagine, having had our learned friends crawling over it for all these years, that anything quite dramatic is going to come out.
In 2 weeks it comes out, I think, so we'll do a special
Definitely.
programme on that, I would think, when that's published.
But just say, Richard, I welcome what's in the Sunday Herald too, because I think it's important to keep items like this on the agenda, because we've got a great ease in this country of letting things slip. I was just thinking this morning, it might be a bit cynical, but I haven't heard this morning about anyone drowning in the Med today because Eurovision was on last night. So it's pushing tragedies off the TV and the newspaper screens. And I know we all get fatigued about all the things that are going on in the world, but the only way we're going to change things is by creating more awareness and more of understanding of how we can actually change things. So I'm glad that this has been regurgitated, if that's the right word for it, because we can't forget what's happened.
No.
Every November we hear the phrase, about let's not forget, and we can't forget what we as a nation did in other parts of the world. We're now starting to pay the price for that, but there's poor innocent people in these countries paying a far heavier price than we ever will. So I welcome the article.
Yeah. In terms of things that have been dragging on for a long time, the Lockerbie controversy continues. Kenny McCaskill.
You had a rant about that this morning.
I did, and I will have a rant later on, but tell us a bit about what he's saying, Michelle.
Well, he's written a book
He has.
which he's serialising in the paper, and I think what he's doing is he's telling stories and sharing memories of what happened when he was the Justice Secretary.
Indeed.
And your point
My
this
point,
morning was that
my point is that I think there's a difference between political autobiographies that reveal what a person was thinking at key moments. I think that's absolutely fine. But I think when a book like this gives information about what was happening at a time that could and should have been put into the public domain at that time, and yet is being held back so that I have to pay for it to read about it in a book when I already pay these people's wages, annoys me. Am I being unfair, Ruth?
I don't think so, but I mean, for me, the interesting thing about this was some detail, which I agree it should have been in the public domain earlier, but the detail about the wheeler dealing that went on in the back rooms between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government is not really very edifying. I mean, I was very proud as a Scot when we released McGrahy from a Scottish jail, and I assumed that was just us being compassionate and cuddly, but according to the account in today's Sunday Times, there was an area over the prisoner transfer agreement,
Yes.
and that McGrahy was originally going to be excluded from that
Yeah.
agreement, and the British government put pressure on the Scottish government to have McGrahy included because they were doing a deal in the desert, as it became known, with McGrahy, with Colonel Gaddafi and with BP for
Yeah.
a very valuable oil contract. Now, if all that's true and Kenny's writing about it in these terms, then it makes us look rather less compassionate than we did before. It makes us look as if we were party to a rather squalid deal with Westminster.
I think there were those discussions taking place, but I don't think that was the mechanism by which McGrahy was released. I think he was released through another mechanism, which is a complicated way of saying. I think that McCaskill is still insisting that the primary, in fact, the only thing that made him decide to release him was compassion, not all these other things, although it's muddied the water by the
Up to a point, Lord
yeah.
Copper, but he's also saying he didn't want him to die in a Scottish jail in case there were reprisals with other Scottish citizens, and that's
right.
slightly different from saying
That
he's a
is.
very old sick man, let's make sure he goes home to his own bed.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so therefore it kind of undermines what he's saying.
The other
by
thing that I think
adding
is
another-
absolutely leaps out at me from this stuff is that, both the Justice Minister at the time and indeed the Lord Advocate at the time, everybody insisted that McGrahy was banged to rights over this. Now we learn that McCaskill thinks it was a conspiracy between a number of Arab countries as a reprisal, if you like, for the bringing down of an Iranian jet. And I mean, lots of people, including the Justice for McGrahy Committee, have been saying that for years. And now the man who was saying, no, 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 is saying, well, actually, yes, it was a conspiracy.
And indeed, I think the former Lord Advocate, the Lord Advocate who's now standing down, is saying, well, there may be another trial later on, which again kind of undermines some of the things that were being said before about this guy was definitely guilty. And that
I
was
would
it.
just like a light shone into that nice Mr. Straw's private archive papers.
I would like to know more about that, certainly. I mean, were you ever convinced by the conviction of McGrahy, Patrick?
No, I never have been, and I find it concerning as an ordinary citizen. I don't have trust in the judicial system in the way that trial took place. I know it was in The Hague and it was supposedly independent and whatnot, but there's just been too many doubts, and I think ordinary people need to have faith and confidence that at whatever level you're taking part in the judicial system, you're going to get a fair hearing. I echo Ruth's point about I was very proud when we released the man, because compassion's got to be the heart of anything that we do, and creating a fairer Scotland and a more inclusive Scotland, we've got to be compassionate. But I also agree with your point. I think it was extremely mercenary of Kenny McCaskill to release details in a book, which I think, and I might be simplistic here, the ownership of those details belong to us, the people. We elected him, we sent him there, we paid his costs, we paid for the office. That was part of the mechanics of the process. We should have been aware of it at the time, and I think it highlights maybe a lack of accountability, which I could probably develop and talk about the lack of scrutiny for the committees in Holyrood, but I won't go down that link because it's some of my best comic material, joking aside. But I think it opens up many more issues, and I really do, and it concerns me when ex-ministers of any government, whether it be the unionist government of Westminster or the government here in Scotland, release details in a book that should have been available to each and every citizen in Scotland.
Absolutely, because as well you would expect for the book to be something that people will buy. It has to include new details, and you have to say, well, why are they new?
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest, I'm a cynic. I'm going to wait and do what happened with Gordon Brown's book and get it for £1 in a pound shop. That way it'll be value for money.
Ooh, meow.
We were talking this morning as well, the aftermath of the Holyrood election,
Yeah.
and Nicola's plan that she's laying out for the next 100 days.
Yes.
We're looking at a potential cabinet reshuffle this week. We already know that she's going to split finance and economy. Are we speculating any further on how that will all
Well,
play out?
first of all, do you think, Ruth, that it's a good idea to split finance?
Absolutely, it was a huge portfolio, and now, I mean, it becomes even more urgent with further, albeit incomplete, tax powers being devolved to Scotland and changes to the way that the welfare payments are organised. I mean, it's a huge job, and I think John Swinney's a class act. But however classy an act he is, that's just too much on his plate. And the Scottish economy is obviously going to be a hugely important portfolio as well. So I mean, I think John Swinney will emerge essentially as the Scottish Chancellor by any other name, and somebody else is going to have a very tough brief with the economic one. But yes, it makes lots of sense, and so too there's a reshuffle, because there's an interesting subplot here about a gender balanced cabinet. Now, I am a fully paid up feminist, of long standing. But I don't actually think, looking for thunderbolts, I don't actually think that should be the most powerful motivation, whether or not you keep gender balance. The most powerful priority should be to get the best people possible round the Scottish Cabinet table. And if that is gender balance, that's terrific, but that shouldn't be the number one priority.
We were talking earlier as well about
I'm sorry,
talent.
I'm what to say here. Yeah.
About the talent within the Scottish Government and the strength of the kind of secondary tier of politicians in government compared to what we've got sitting in the Cabinet. Who do you move where? Who do you how do you bring people through? And when you've got some really, really good new candidates who have now become MSPs, how do they fit in? Do they have a role to play?
That's a great difficulty, Michelle, because there are, I mean, there's some cracking new MSPs have come through, and with lots of experience in different fields and in a different world, in different circumstances, and with different chronology, they might have been promoted. But you can't take somebody from an election, 2 weeks ago and pop them into the Cabinet. But I think that this particular intake shows a lot of promise for the future.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most difficult things or subjects, I guess, for the SNP to grapple with has been tax. I don't know what your views on their tax plans were. I know some people were disappointed in their lack of, I guess, progressive element.
I'll be honest, Richard, I'm very, if it was up to me, I would promote Jean Freeman straight away. For one reason, I think politicians in Holyrood, Westminster get caught in a bubble, and I've been in the bubble, and they don't know what's going on. I think getting some fresh blood in there just now would make a great difference to the Scottish Cabinet. I would also have a Minister for Poverty of Opportunity, which is one of the biggest things we have in Scotland. So I would be far more radical, and I would be
radical about tax.
I would be extremely radical about tax.
What does that mean?
Well, I would raise taxes, right, which is not an easy thing to say, but I look at my own community in Airdrie and I see community services being cut, and for many people it's often the lack of socialisation, where people aren't getting out to events, aren't taking part, aren't getting a chance to exercise their creative juices. There is so much talent in Scotland just being dampened down at the moment, almost a dumbing down, because so many services are being cut. And I think sometimes, I do it with my household budget, I'll spend money on something I might not have spent it on 2 years ago, because long term I think there's a benefit actually doing that. And I think we'll get I think we're becoming too divided as a society in Scotland. And communities out in Lanarkshire where I live, I'm seeing real poverty, and the current tax plans I don't think give us the power or the money to effect real change in those communities. And I support the SNP because I think out of the parties they are the most socially conscious, but I think they've got to make a hard decision and say, look, we need more money to do these things because it's investing in our people. And it's one of those throwaway phrases, our best assets are people. I believe that.
Kezia Dugdale wants to increase taxes as well. In fact, she's gone further. She suggested that there should be a kind of coalition of left-wing parties in Holyrood who would then stop the SNP from introducing the tax plans that were in its manifesto. Do you think that's a...
Well, I certainly think that the tax plans of the SNP were modest, and I wouldn't hang about waiting to increase the top rate of tax at all. I mean, I think that was a good policy. And it's the old story. You can't get Scandinavian level of services with American-style taxes. And that's a bullet that the government's got to bite.
Modest, but supported or at least voted for by, 49% of the population, whereas the Kezia Dugdale's tax plans were voted for by about, 15% of the population.
It kind of depends who's selling them and how they're sold.
Okay, yeah, but it's a difficult democratic argument to make that don't introduce the tax plans that were voted for by a 49% of the population, but instead work to introduce plans that were voted for by... But
governments are supposed to lead as well. I mean, by your reckoning, we would have hanged another 3 or 4 dozen people by now, because if you do a poll in hanging, you'll find that 55% would like people strung up, and that doesn't, in my view, make it a better democracy.
Okay. I could argue something like that, but I'm not going to do that because we're going to move on.
We're talking about Liz Lockhead today.
We are, and this is quite easy for us to talk about because Ruth, you can't talk about it because it's a bit creative.
Well, I
Scotland.
can say that Liz Lochhead was a terrific macker,
Yeah.
and I think Jackie Kay will be a terrific macker, and I think Liz has always got interesting things to say.
Yeah.
But I am still on the board of Creative Scotland, so the only comment I would make about what she's saying today, she's saying lots of things about the way in which funding is dispersed, and nobody's ever going to be popular dispersing funds, but all I would say is that one of the latest things that Creative Scotland have done to try and diffuse criticism of faceless bureaucrats making all these decisions is they have just had a huge exercise in hiring peer group assessors for all the art forms, so that it isn't just somebody with a set of boxes to be ticked.
She's making a number of comments, I guess, some of them difficult for us to discuss. She's unhappy about her losing the job of Macker and the way the kind of transition was handled. I don't know enough about the behind the scenes thing there, but she wanders, Patrick, you might be convinced in this, she wanders into some of the areas that have been problematic in terms of arts in Scotland, one of them being the number of people that are Scottish that are in charge, the small number of people that are Scottish that are in charge of our cultural institutions. Is that an issue? Because whenever you raise it, you're accused of being racist.
Yeah, it is a difficult issue. I find the arts in Scotland very, very peculiar because comedy's not considered an art form by many people, and it's very difficult to get funding for comedy. And if you think back to the old days, people would say, oh, boxing's a way out of the gutter for the working man. Comedy's a great way out, and it's a great opportunity for many people throughout Scotland. But we've got that ceiling where you start to do well in Scotland, people go, you've got to go to London, you've got to go to London, you've got to go to London. And even in music, my daughter's a singer, and she's got a wee record deal and she's doing okay, but they're now saying you might have to go to London. Yeah. And I just think we put too much of a glass ceiling on our own youth and our own opportunity for diversifying talent in Scotland. And I think Creative Scotland, I think it's great to have opera and it's great to have plays and drama. I think all these things are fantastic. But I do think there's a big segment missing, and that is comedy.
Could I just make the point
Yes.
that in terms of opera and the National Theatre and all that, they're funded directly by the government, not by Creative Scotland. So all the national companies are funded directly by government and not by Creative Scotland, just as a point of...
Yeah, I was the one that, the only reason I mentioned it because I've been to theatres and said I would like to put comedy shows on, and I've been told, sorry, there's no funding available for supporting comedy, but we could support other arts. And it's just, it's like someone said earlier on, if you're not getting the funding, you're the one with the anger about it because you've been told you're not getting funded and someone else is. But I just think the mainstream comedy world adds a lot of social commentary. It gets people out and about. The little community comedy clubs springing up over Scotland. And for me, that's the type of vehicle that Creative Scotland should be saying.
Sounds pretty healthy to me if there's comedy clubs springing up all over Scotland.
Yeah, but the problem is none of us get paid. They're all free gigs because there's no money in the game. And for people like myself, this is my only source of income, other than being a male model, and that just ain't working.
You were talking there about...
I think you should stick to the modelling.
You were talking there about community and the importance of what was on in community, and you wanted to talk a bit about football and the impact of local clubs in their local communities.
I don't think people realise the importance football has for Scotland, because I go to Canada every year and people say, oh, I left Scotland 30 years ago, but every week I look for the Falkirk result or the Motherwell result, and throughout the world people tune into our football results on a Saturday. I'm a director at Albion Rovers, have been for 12 years. This season we finished in our highest ever position in 142 years as a football club. We're having a bit of success, but what we're doing off the park is important. 2 or 3 years ago I took children out to Auschwitz through a programme funded and organised through Albion Rovers. We work in the schools, we do health and fitness. Obviously, I'm not involved in that side of it. Imagine me giving the kids fitness lessons. But we do so much, and it's the same throughout Scotland. And East Stirlingshire, a club most people call East Stirling, but actually East Stirlingshire yesterday lost to Edinburgh City, and they've been relegated out of the Scottish Football League. And do you know what? I sat last night and listened to it, and I felt so sorry for the East Stirlingshire fans, because they're a very, very small band. And a bit like Celtic, they don't get to open the top tier very often. They're a very, very small band.
Just couldn't resist. They couldn't resist.
They're a very, very, very small band of people. But again, like Celtic fans, they're extremely faithful, and they go and they travel all over the country to watch their team. And that's just been taken away from them. But I don't think people realise the trickle-down effect that has in the community. If you're from Airdrie and you want to play for Airdrie Football Club, it's an aspiration, it's a hope, it's a reason for being involved in sport. And again, when you're going out to football training, you're getting right messages put out to you, you're playing as part of a team, you're learning all these different things. So I think football is one of the biggest glues in our societies and in our society, and people don't realise that. And I really felt for the people at the Shire yesterday.
Maybe East Stirlingshire should hire Boris Johnson to come and do a gig for them. Fill the stadium.
Indeed. And on that note, we're going to say goodbye for now. Patrick, thank you very much for that. Thank you. And we're going to say hello to Ewan McElvany.
Yeah, Ewan is a young Scottish singer-songwriter. He's making his mark in the Scottish music scene, and today he's going to play one of his own songs for us. Ewan, can you tell us about it?
Yes, certainly. So this particular song is an attempt to try and capture the attitude towards women from certain young men in today's society, which still falls short of the margin as far as I'm concerned. And it's called Scarlet Halleck.
With hair like fire, she plays with desire. The scarlet harlot hunts tonight. The game is on, don't be her pawn. The pretty ones will soon be gone. She's growing old, she licks from the bowl to save her soul. Who are you to pass that judgment through? Who are you? Your skin is rough to the touch, and the way you dress is a bit too much. You're second gear, but have no fear. You're looking better with every beer. She's growing old, she licks from the bowl to save her soul. Growing old, she licks from the bowl to save her soul. So here are you to pass that judgment through. Here are you.
It was great. We'll have some more from Ewan later on. I'd like to introduce our next guest now. Ruth is staying with us for this discussion. Our next guest is Blair Jenkins, who's the former boss of Yes Scotland and also the author of the last major report on broadcasting in Scotland, which suggested setting up another separate news channel for BBC in Scotland, not included in the BBC's white paper released this week. Were you disappointed in that?
Yes, but not surprised. I think it had been clear for some time that the BBC was not going to endorse the notion of a distinctive Scottish channel, the first ever television channel aimed at, certainly English language channel, aimed at people in Scotland. I do think that's a missed opportunity. I still think it's something that we need, and I think it's something we deserve. If you look around Europe, I cannot think of another country, even territory or region, as distinctive as Scotland is, which doesn't have its own dedicated television service. So disappointed about that, but as I say, it had been signalled for some time that that wasn't going to feature in the recommendations. Honestly, I don't think there's all that much that changes things visibly for audiences in Scotland in what was in the white paper this week. There are changes behind the scenes, but in terms of what people see and hear, I think we have to remain sceptical about whether we'll see much change.
Okay, what are our views on the BBC during the referendum campaign? The BBC came under fire for bias. There were demonstrations outside the building in Glasgow. So I guess, why would we want more power given to the BBC in Scotland if we're unhappy with how it behaved in the referendum? Ruth, what is your view, if you could rewind, I suppose the question is, what is your view on the allegations of bias levelled at the BBC?
Well, I've got to come on to that in a second, but if I could just quickly do a PS to what Blair said, because Scotland was mentioned in the white paper. We were going to get a subcommittee, so don't get too excited here. We were going to get a subcommittee who, in addition to having somebody, a person on the national board in London, the UK board, we would have a subcommittee in Scotland who would attend to all our needs. Now, I mean,
are you suggesting we shouldn't be happy with that?
I'm suggesting that shows the same poverty of ambition with which this argument has been scarred all the way along. Absolutely. As far as the referendum campaign is concerned, I don't actually, I've got a lot of friends in the BBC, at reporter and commentator level, and I honestly don't think there was any institutional bias within the BBC on the referendum. I really don't believe that. What I do think happened was a lot of the BBC Southern Cavalry came over the border, riding over the border without having done any of their constitutional homework. I don't think they understood what was going on in Scotland. They didn't understand the arguments. They certainly didn't understand the nuances, and they got into trouble for putting. Nick Robinson got a huge amount of stick. Now, I don't actually think that Nick Robinson came over the border in order to put a stake through the heart of Scottish independence. I just don't think he understood the brief properly.
The white paper suggests that BBC needs to do more to reflect life in Scotland and indeed other nations within the UK. How do you think they should do that, first of all?
Well, I think there's quite a long shopping list, I suppose most of us would have. The general point is I think we need to see a greater level of energy and ambition from BBC Scotland. When you move below that to other things, I think a wider range of programmes, of well-funded Scottish programmes, would be appropriate. If we can't have a dedicated channel, let's at least reflect contemporary Scotland a bit more. I think too much of the output, certainly in television, is focused on the past. In a sense, the past is a safer place to be for programme makers because it's less controversial than the present or indeed the future. So I think probably it's been a low-risk strategy that's been employed at the BBC in Scotland for a number of years now. It seems there's almost been a corporate sense of keeping your head down and hoping for a quiet life. Nobody gets a quiet life in Scotland anymore. We're all out there now. We're engaged. This is a vibrant, dynamic country. I think we need to see that reflected more of contemporary Scotland being reflected. So, I don't really, it wouldn't be my instinct to be cynical about the white paper or about the BBC, but I do think we need to be But we do need to be sceptical and we do need to be vigilant. The main document from our point of view is not so much the white paper itself, where the references to Scotland are relatively brief. It's the sort of side letter which was sent by the Director General, Tony Hall, to Fiona Hislop, in which he runs through what he regards as the items on the agenda to be dealt with over the coming months. And on the face of it, it looks like what they're talking about is enhanced funding for the BBC in Scotland, not quantified, but enhanced funding, a ring-fenced operational budget, scheduling and commissioning autonomy in Scotland, certainly for the Scottish content, the subcommittee that Ruth mentioned, and I do believe that the first item of business when that group meets the first time is to describe themselves as the Scottish Board or the Scotland Board of the BBC and not as a subcommittee. Greater accountability via the Parliament to the people who pay the licence fee in Scotland. So a lot of things that we can.
A bigger share of that licence fee?
Well, potentially yes, that's certainly what they're saying. But at the moment, I think the Tory Hall letter read to me more like a list of good intentions rather than firm commitments at the moment. And to be honest, the BBC has let us down frequently in the past. it has never fully got Scotland. I think we've been peripheral to the BBC in every sense, so we need to keep an eye on this and see what happens.
Can I ask Blair a question? Because one of the things that I found
Feel
really...
free.
Thank you, Richard. One of the things I found really odd was when there was a
Yeah.
huge chunk of investment in Scotland, the Pacific Quay building, which is a fine building in many ways, and it did demonstrate a huge investment. But then what happened immediately afterwards was a whole shed load of programmes. London programmes
Yeah.
were made up here. So Anne Robinson came up to make the Weakest Link, and Waterloo Road came up, and all of these things. It's as if sort of outsourcing programme making from London into a barn in Scotland suddenly made it a Scottish programme, and that's not my definition of a Scottish programme.
It's not. Unfortunately, it met the Ofcom definition, which was one the BBC was being driven by. And I think you're right. I think what happened was that reluctantly the BBC agreed to commission a more appropriate share of its network programming from Scotland, and that was as a result of the Scottish
But they
Broadcasting
weren't commissioning
Commission.
Scottish broadcasters to make
No.
network programmes.
No, but they were meeting the criteria of how much of the budget was being spent in Scotland, what percentage of the staff were based here. So there's almost these were technically, if you like, Scottish productions. In reality, they were not very
I mean, it
Scottish.
was an alibi.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Is
We're
it
measuring
true
the wrong things.
Well,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
Is it true to say that some of the boxes that needed ticked were boxes, for instance, of employing certain number of camera operators, etc. So therefore, it doesn't really matter to an extent of what they were making, whether it reflected Scotland or not. They were making a programme and therefore getting somebody employed. Is that?
That's what happened. I mean, they're if you like, they're observing the letter of what they'd agreed to do, but not the spirit of it. The spirit of it, as we all understood it, post the Broadcasting Commission, was that there was going to be a real injection of finance into Scotland and an appetite for more programming from Scotland for the UK networks. That hasn't really happened. I think the BBC, to some extent, is now acknowledging that they didn't get this right, and I think we can look for improvement in that area.
Scottish Six. We've talked about the Scottish Six forever. I can't remember a time where we didn't talk about the Scottish Six, and now it's back on the agenda. Would the Scottish Six help, Ruth?
Well, as originally envisaged, it's probably maybe past its sell by date as a concept, but the underlying principles are still valid, which is that in Scotland you have a news programme, an hour-long news programme, which does two things. First of all, it reports from a position of interior knowledge about things that are important to Scotland, but equally vitally, it looks at UK national and international issues through the prism of Scottish understanding and Scottish values. And I think that's really important, and it was bad-mouthed and maligned at the time by people who should have known better, who suggested that what we would have would be an hour of murders in Motherwell instead of things that actually mattered. And that, I think, said a lot about what people thought of Scottish journalism. The idea that news broadcasters, as indeed Blair used to do, the idea that somebody like Blair wouldn't be able to determine what was the most important story of the day, I thought was profoundly insulting.
You touched on licensing earlier, and the way people consume their television now is vastly different to the way they did even 2 years ago.
Yeah.
How long can the BBC sustain the current licensing model before it's forced down the route of a subscription model?
Well, I hope for a long time, and I support the principle behind the licence fee. I think that, the BBC being a universally available service and given a very firm, if you like, public service remit, I think public service broadcasting is more important now than it has been, not less important. I think it becomes ever more important. As newspapers become ever more partisan in their coverage, I think the scope or the argument for an impartial broadcaster becomes very, very strong. You're right that there are things in the technical structure of broadcasting and media distribution which might make it difficult to sustain a licence fee as a model going forward. And at that point, when we get to that point, I would hope that there is still, if it has to be an allocation of a portion of tax revenues that funds something like the BBC, then I would rather do that than abandon the notion of it being publicly funded. The minute we start having a broadcaster like the BBC competing for revenue with commercial broadcasters, then the essence of the BBC, the values and the ethics it stands for, I think, begin to erode. It was Michael Grade who famously once said that the BBC keeps us all honest. And I think there's still a role for the BBC. It's one of the things, irrespective of how one thinks the BBC performed during the independence referendum, and I had my concerns and I've expressed my concerns, we all need the BBC to work. It's very important. It has a greater reach in terms of its news and current affairs, its information service than any other media outlet. Something like 75% of the population in Scotland use BBC every week. And we do just need it as part of our media landscape, as part of our cultural and informational landscape.
I think too the white paper did say that now the licence fee would have to extend to people who just access the programmes via
Yes,
iPlayer.
yes.
So I mean, so they picked up that tab, and we haven't, of course, because it wasn't part of that white paper, we haven't mentioned Channel 4, but I think as a public service broadcaster, its survival in its current form is quite important too.
Yeah, absolutely. Could I just slightly go back to the Scottish Six point, just to say, someone who has been involved in that debate for rather a long time. The key point about whether or not we have an integrated news service, and I've always been a supporter, the key thing is that decision is made in Scotland. And this new Scottish board, when it is set up, the new Scottish board, when it is set up, I think should make the decision with BBC Scotland management on whether this is the right thing to do in Scotland. This is not a decision that should be made in London. Anyone who thinks that a decision like this about what is right for news viewers in Scotland should be made in London just isn't paying attention.
That's true, but London would need to be in agreement, because London would need to then make a change to what it does in news, and they also need to make resource available. For instance, if it had a reporter in Iraq, then that BBC Scotland would have to have access to that report and judge where it would fit in the schedule.
But they wouldn't necessarily have to change, because if you had we keep calling it a Scottish Six, and it would of course be something else, and other models I believe are being tried, but it wouldn't be, London could do what London wants to do in the same way as we would do what we want to do, and if we were on air at 6 o'clock, we wouldn't be following the London agenda. We would be changing our news schedule to suit what was appropriate for Scotland, and that wouldn't in any way imperil what London felt was important for their viewers.
I didn't mean it would imperil it. I did mean that they would have to have a discussion with London and say, right, your report from Iraq or
we'd like that.
We would want that, please. And we would, instead of having it second, we would have it fourth, or instead of having it fourth, we would have it second, whatever way we want to play it.
I think a very important point here is that I don't think you can view the argument about what's right between 6 and 7 p.m. on BBC One in Scotland in isolation. My own view would be that this is a good opportunity to almost start with a blank sheet of paper in Scotland with the BBC, and to say, okay, what do we want, what do we need? And you'd have to view the television news offering alongside the radio offering, what we do in television current affairs, high time, we had our own Scottish question time, those kind of things, the online offering. I think if the words of the Tony Hall letter are to be taken at face value, then an enhanced budget is to be made available to the BBC in Scotland, and how that is spent will be up to the BBC in Scotland with this new supervisory body. So we take a comprehensive view. I think at that point you take a comprehensive view across. Nothing is guaranteed to be in. Nothing is ruled out. Let's look afresh at this. I think the BBC needs to reboot in Scotland. I do think it needs to almost start again from scratch and rebuild, regain the trust of some parts of the audience, and deserve the trust of people going forward. And
you make a really important point, of course, that, I said 6 to 7 because I'm chronologically gifted, but actually most people access the news as and when now, and so there's nothing sacrosanct about that particular hour.
No, that's true.
We can't let you go without talking about IndieRef 2.
You know something I don't?
Not yet. We were talking yesterday, Women for Indie had their National Executive Committee meeting yesterday, so we were talking about concerns amongst all the groups that since the Holyrood election has pitted unionists against nationalists even more so than during the referendum, that we need to have some conversations about the future that aren't tribal in nature. So we were getting to the point that it's more about the journey than the timing of IndieRef 2. What needs to be done to get Scotland to a place where people feel it feels natural and safe to be independent?
Well, gosh, that's a really good question. I think what should encourage us in looking at that is the experience we had in the first referendum, because what we did was we had a fantastic, not I was going to say a national conversation, millions of conversations around the country about what kind of country we wanted to be, what kind of society we wanted to live in. And that was the wonderful thing about the referendum, was all that positive energy about discussing the kind of society we wish to be. I have never believed that it was likely at all that there would be a second independence referendum in the current Scottish Parliament. I always thought it was more likely to be after 2021, and I still think on balance that is more likely. I mean, leaving aside the European referendum, which could disturb that, but leaving aside that caveat, I think it's more likely the next referendum will be after 2021. I do think that recently, on both sides, certainly on the yes side, it's reverted to be much more of a party political type of initiative, and that's because we've been going through party-based elections. At some point, I do think a broader yes alliance has to be reconstituted, and those kind of discussions have to happen through Women for Independence and others, and the non-political parts of Scotland, if you like, who were such a vital part of the first independence campaign, have to start talking to one another again and answering some of the questions which are still legitimate questions from the first referendum. So I think we've got time for that, because I do think the time scale is, it's more likely to be 2022 than any year before then. And we should be absolutely, as a country, continuing to talk about what are our values, what's important to us, which constitutional future is more likely to deliver the kind of Scotland we want.
Ruth, do you detect any kind of fracturing within what might be described as the yes movement, or some people call it the yes family? Do you think it's less of a family after the
It's
election?
such a difficult one, Richard, because they're obviously, as Blair's pointed out, when you're in a kind of tribal election period, then of course these fissures open up again, not least obviously in the Labour Party, where there was a huge number of huge lot of seepage into the yes camp. I've kind of changed my mind about this. I used to think, and part of me still does, that if we have another referendum and we lose it, then, as they say in my hometown, the game's a bogey, and I can see why people wouldn't want to risk that. However, I now think honestly that if I've heard the government talking about, if the polls say 60% plus for a reasonable amount of time, that's the time to go for it. I think all governments, including the Scottish government, reach a kind of peak of popularity, and they keep that for a while, and then inevitably, just as the political cycle goes, the natural way of political life is that they lose some popularity. My fear would be that if there isn't a second referendum, while this government and this First Minister is as popular as it and she is, then you might lose momentum, and it might be difficult to get that back again. And Blair knows better than anybody that the campaign went from 20-something% in favour of yes to 45%. Campaigns themselves have a huge dynamic and a huge influence. So I wouldn't be worried about it being 60% at the start. I would just worry about it being 60% at the end.
I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. We could have chatted for much, much longer. Thank you both very much. It was really good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we get to the fun part of the show, and we get Patrick back.
The show is all fun.
The funner part, if that's a word.
Yeah.
It's not a word, is it? No, it's not a word. Patrick, welcome back.
Good to be back.
Yes. Your roundup of the week in politics.
Well, my round of the week in politics is all based around one phrase: self-awareness. I think politicians lack self-awareness, and there's some quite funny things to show that. I've always been self-aware. During the referendum, I was brought down to earth with a bang. I knocked on a door, and a little boy about 8 answered the door holding a cigar and a glass of whiskey. I said, "Is your dad in?" He says, "Does it look like it, fatty?" And at that point, I realised never to take anything for granted in politics. And I think you need to take a look at yourself. I mean, I've got a Twitch. Only 4 in 100,000 people get this, so I am blessed. I've been very, very lucky on that front. And I went to the doctor, and he suggested a brain operation, which would leave a scar from there to there in the last 6 hours, to put a pressure pad between my 6th crinoid nerve and a blood vessel, Botox injections, or to go for barbiturates. And being a comedian, I went for option 4, which is a patch and a pirate act. OR. But what I'm saying is, you have to be conscious of who you are and how you actually look. And I think a lot of politicians over the last week have demonstrated that they don't actually do that. One of the funniest lines I heard was during just after the election, when Mundell number 2 was elected, and my mum was sitting watching TV, and the two of them had been interviewed, and she came out with that old line from the Glasgow Empire: "Oh no, there's 2 of them." So I don't know if they were actually aware of how they actually looked as a double act. But it's been all over politics this week. When the people became MSPs, they had to go along and swear their oath, and there was much comment in social media out my way about the candidate from Coatbridge in Christen, who was part of a Where's Wally search within the Herald, and they weren't very successful, but they might be able to track him down easier now. But he actually turned up looking like Oswald Cobblepot out of Gotham, which got him much derision on Facebook. And I just wonder, maybe when he went to hire that wedding outfit to be sworn into Parliament, he should have looked in the mirror before he actually went there. And the whole question, I thought it was absolutely hilarious. Mundell's comments this week on holding the SNP to task. And the football analogy for me is a bit like Real Madrid and Eintracht Frankfurt when you lose 7-2 and you think you've won the game. And I think that's where David Mundell is at the moment. His team lost 8-2 and he's running about totally self-deluded, thinking the Conservatives are going to drive the agenda in Scottish politics. But in terms of the funniest thing for me was the people who wanted to be the presiding officer. I just think it was hilarious when you looked at the candidates. Joanne Lamont, who came forward as a candidate who would bring the Parliament together and bring consensus. And I thought that's a bit like Attila the Hun taking over from Kofi Annan. It just was never going to happen. And I was laughing at the fact that she actually had no awareness of how her politics were perceived with ordinary people in Scotland. The next candidate who came across was Ken McIntosh, and I thought that was enlightening. Ken came across and he said, I'm going to reinvigorate Parliament, I'm going to bring a new energy and new change. And I thought, nah, it's just not going to happen, because Ken lacks energy, he lacks drive, but he does have one saving point in his favour. He's actually performed a miracle. And it's actually listed in the Lancet magazine. Shortly after Ken was elected to Holyrood many years ago, there was a case reported of a patient in the Southern General Hospital who'd been in a coma for 14 years and they'd never been able to bring the patient around. And they moved him into an open ward and someone had the radio on, and Ken McIntosh was being interviewed on radio, and the patient woke up, climbed out the bed, walked across, switched off the radio and went back to bed. So my final point for the week is I just hope that Ken McIntosh doesn't achieve that for the Scottish Parliament. So that's my wee take on the week.
Thank you very
Patrick,
much.
thank you.
Thank you. Bit harsh, but there you go.
There you go.
Funny what I say.
Indeed. Patrick's going to stay with us just now, and we're now going to welcome on stage David Pratt, who's the contributing foreign editor to the Sunday Herald. And one of those leaps that we take
Well, you know,
from comedy
I always
to
feel,
tragedy.
you know, I mean, I take on my mantle as the international man of misery, you know, following on from Patrick, because certainly in international terms, it has been a pretty miserable week, especially.
Well, we talked about Chilcot earlier on, and Blair in Iraq, and things haven't been going well in Iraq even today. I think there's been some news.
Well, that would be an understatement. I mean, you know, to say things are not going well at the moment in Iraq, and I mean, here we are. We're still reaping the whirlwind, if you like, of the war that Tony Blair and George W. Bush actually, you know, prosecuted at that time. It's still coming back to haunt us, and coming back to haunt the Iraqi people even more. If I can just talk you through the events of this week, because it's really very, very complicated. I mean, even for people across foreign affairs at the moment. But what we've basically got, if I can take Baghdad to begin with, you've had a series of bombings there, and indeed there's another bombing reported this afternoon, perpetrated by IS against a gas plant. Now, this series of bombings that are taking place is an attempt by IS, obviously, to exploit the incredibly fractious situation that's going on in Baghdad at the moment. And that fractious situation is a result of many factors. There's huge unemployment at the moment. There's lots of concern over corruption. There's great disaffection with the al-Abadi government. And one of the people driving the disaffection and certainly orchestrating some of the protests is a chap called Muqtada al-Sadr, you know, who's a Shia leader there. And of course, Iraq is a predominantly Shia country. So he has been helping orchestrate many of the protests, particularly in the Green Zone, which we're all familiar with, which is, it's got a kind of iconic symbolism. That's where the coalition was housed during the occupation, and where a lot of Iraqi politicians continue to stay. So, you know, there are these incredible fractious differences taking place, but the interesting thing is that Muqtada al-Sadr tends to rise to the surface whenever his own power has been eclipsed. And that power has been eclipsed by other Shiite paramilitaries recently. And of course, Iran will be looking on nervously because, you know, it's their great Shia neighbour, you know, and they have a tremendous influence in Baghdad. And the Americans will be looking on even more nervously because they're hoping for a comparatively stable Baghdad, which will help take the war to IS at the moment. And that's proving very difficult for them. IS know this, and therefore we've had this spate of bombings to try and exacerbate the situation. So it's a complicated state of affairs, and that's before we even head north.
Is it ever going to get any better?
It doesn't look as if it's going to get better in the short or indeed even in the long term. I mean, I was in Iraqi Kurdistan just a few months ago, and while there I actually had interviews and talks with some leading Kurdish officials, because you've got to remember that Iraqi Kurdistan is almost an autonomous or semi-autonomous part of the country. And, you know, there were people there from the Foreign Relations Department, the Chiefs of Staff of the Prime Minister I spoke with. And, you know, they're all very concerned about, there's this huge battle looming for Iraq's second city. We've spoken about Baghdad. The second city is Mosul, which is controlled by IS at the moment. It's a huge place. And if you think of how long it took the Iraqi forces to retake the town of Ramadi recently, 6 months to clear it, they're now faced with trying to take the second largest city from IS. Who is going to conduct the campaign to do that? Obviously with the help of the Americans. It will be primarily Shia militias. It's a Sunni city, so, you know, and IS are well dug in there. And the Kurds will probably participate in that campaign because they're militarily very, very adept. Although many Kurds I spoke to said, well, you know, why should we spill Kurdish blood for a Sunni town? But it is an important strategic move in terms of routing IS out of that area. So the north of the country itself is riven with problems as well. And privately, just to answer your question, I suppose, about it getting better, certainly the Kurds that I spoke to feel that even if tomorrow morning, if we could wave a magic wand and IS were kicked out of that part of Iraq, that potentially there's another conflict looming between the Kurds and Baghdad itself, in terms of the Kurds aspire to full independence. Indeed, it's why the Kurds are actually fascinated by the Scottish referendum experience, strangely enough. The Kurds are really intrigued by that. So there is, in the long term, maybe another looming conflict, depressingly.
Patrick, do you ever feel that you've just had enough of listening to it? I mean, Iraq's been going on for so long, we think it's getting a bit better, then it just reverts to chaos.
I do feel that, and I'll tell you why I feel that way, and it's wrong to feel that. I feel that way because I think in the mainstream media it's been dehumanised. I think we forget that there's mothers with young children who go out to get a loaf of bread and don't go home. And I think one of the reasons I like David's work is because David actually goes to these places and reports from there, and he writes with a knowledge that's informed. But more important, there's a lot of compassion in what you write, and you use the humanist term very often about the human beings that are involved in it. And I think it's one of the saddest aspects of the mainstream media that they manage to dehumanise so many important issues. And this one particularly concerns me because the people at the bottom, the working people, I don't want to get any class structures, but the ordinary punter always pays the price for whatever is decided by the people at the top. And it's brutal what's happening there, there's no words. But what really concerns me is that people here in the West don't realise what's coming our way unless we do something about these situations. And we also don't realise, going back to what we talked about earlier, about how culpable we are in a lot of what's actually taking place.
I mean, it's a good point, Patrick, you know, because most Iraqis, whether they be in Baghdad, you know, whether it be Sunni, whether it be Shia, whether it be Kurdish, are sick and tired of war. The vast majority of ordinary Iraqis you speak to, they've had enough of the instability and the suicide bombings and the car bombings and the inter sort of ethnic troubles that are going on. They're sick and tired of it, you know. But no one has been able to actually construct a government, you know, and we are, of course, are instrumental in the situation we're in at the moment, but we're not really supporting in the way we should be either to help them actually get in place a degree of stability. It's not helped, of course, when you've got IS on your doorstep, quite literally, who are stirring up the hornet's nest at every available opportunity. But, you know, there's another, just interestingly, when you talk about the importance of ordinary people in the dehumanisation process, I last week interviewed Staffan. It was an exclusive interview from a newspaper perspective. Staffan de Mistura, who's the UN Special Envoy to Syria, who was in Scotland here as part of this programme for a Syrian Women's Advisory Board. And what was fantastically interesting about what de Mistura said to me was that when he came in, I mean, this is the job no one wants. I mean, a horrendous job. The man meant to bring peace to Syria. And he said when he came in, one of the biggest problems he had was trust with the Syrian people, because they see this as just a bunch of guys sitting in a 4-star hotel in Geneva discussing the future of a region, and they don't listen to the Syrian people. They dehumanise the situation. And what he's tried to do is to humanise that again, and hence the creation of this Syrian Women's Advisory Board. Because these women, as he was explaining, come from every facet of Syrian society. There are government supporters, there's opposition people, there's religiously fundamental people. They're all key activists. And they keep reminding me, as he said to me the other day, what they've done is remind me that this is about people. This is not just about grand diplomacy. In the bottom line, it's about people.
There were 10 members of this board.
But there's 12 in total. There
Here.
were 12. There were 10 here in Scotland. They were at the Scottish Parliament. They had a free 4-day programme here in Scotland. It's also heavily involved with a think tank called Beyond Borders, I think what I've mentioned before. And indeed, Mark Muller-Stewart, who is the founder of Beyond Borders, he's a barrister in London, he's an advisor in international law and international affairs, is also one of Staffan de Mistura's key advisors. And it was he and Beyond Borders that said, you know something, Scotland's a perfect place here for these Syrian women to come and actually find a platform to sit down, talk, explore a few issues. And that's what they've done. And they've had phenomenal support from the First Minister, from the Scottish Government itself, who helped fund it along with the Dutch and the Norwegians. And I think it's fantastic that we're in the position to be able to do that. And bringing it back, it's a human thing. These are women, some of them have been tortured, some of them have seen their sisters, their brothers, their sons are in jail. They've gone through a terrible time. And as he said, instead of actually diplomacy that operates from the top down, these women, who are networked to thousands of ordinary Syrians on the ground, are able to relay back to what is actually happening. He takes that on board.
That's what I wanted to ask about. This board, what will these women be doing practically now that they're back home in Syria?
Well, they've almost been kind of cherry-picked. I mean, they were known, as the Mistura said to me, I said, where do they come from? Who are these 12 remarkable women? And they were partly known, I think, to the UN negotiation team because they'd obviously excelled in terms of working in humanitarian quarters. They'd stepped out, if you like, from the morass of the population. They were already active, they were very courageous, irrespective of their loyalties and liabilities and difficulties. So they stood out and they were brought together. And as he said, the remarkable thing is they're actually sitting down and talking to each other. And they were doing that in Scotland only this week. Now, as he said, that's, from a gender perspective as well, that's really important because, frankly, a lot of the men that he deals with on the diplomatic level don't sit down and have the kind of conversation. Women see wars quite often in a very, very different way from their male counterparts.
Could I ask you a question, David? Do you get frustrated when, you passed out knowledge here and shared things with it, most of us, I wasn't aware of. Do you get frustrated that doesn't get out there in the West?
I do get frustrated, and the thing is that the inevitable question is that people they glaze over when you talk about something like Syria. It's complicated, it's labyrinthine, there's so many players. Mistura himself was saying to me, I have to work a negotiating system here with 86 fighting groups and 18 major players. That's before you even get to the whole the regional and international level. How do you hold that together? So when people despair of the situation, imagine being in the position of trying to do that particular job. And as he said, we don't even have direct talks at the moment. There's only proximity talks because most of these people won't sit down and talk to each other, with the great exception in this case of this Syrian Women's Advisory Board, who are showing a great example of what can be done.
What was it that brought them to Scotland specifically? What experience have we got that they could learn from?
He emphasised again and again, as I was writing in today's paper, that Scotland's democratic credentials, its non-violent constitutional journey. We've had an enormous political event here. Were there any bullets? Were there any guns? Were there any masks? No, it was a non-violent constitutional journey.
As in not Ulsterisation?
It was not the Ulsterisation.
Making that point?
Well, it's a very good point. This is where the nonsense of this. The top UN diplomat is saying the opposite of those people who are suggesting that there's an Ulsterisation of the Scottish political process. Complete and utter nonsense. So the other aspect was obviously gender politics. The gender balance. You have a First Minister who's a female. You have two women in opposition who are female. The representation, the way women's policies have come through. All of these aspects were key democratic credentials that he felt were fantastic in terms of allowing a small nation like Scotland to diplomatically kind of punch above its weight. What he would not be drawn on, interestingly, because I actually put the question to him, and he went straight into diplomat mode when I said to him, okay, if we were independent, if we had have voted yes and we were an independent Scotland, this example of the Syrian Women's Advisory Board, is that a kind of example of the soft foreign policy approach that Scotland could bring to the kind of diplomatic table? And he said, well, I won't, that's an internal issue.
You knew he would say
and I wouldn't, well, I mean, you know,
You did.
he is one of the world's leading diplomats, and he has,
ask.
you've got to ask him. But he did emphasise the fact that those qualities that Scotland has shown thus far in its democratic journey are qualities that we can build on when we're independent. And I say when, not if.
Women for Independence.
Yes.
Clearly, I mean, you were involved with that yourself. What was it that that organisation thought needed a particularly women's group or a women's interest to be represented in the independence debate?
Because nobody else was doing it. Nobody else was doing it. Women weren't being seen to be engaged in the whole process. And the likes of Jean Freeman and Carolyn Leckie decided that they had to give women a voice somehow, and they weren't sure how they would do it. And the way Women for Independence grew was phenomenal. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of members who are all now continuing to be engaged. We have listening exercises going on all the time where we're finding out what it is that bothers them, what it is they want to see in Scotland. We're about to start another one about the questions that would need to be answered before another referendum, what matters to them, what would convince them, and some are now are not quite sure anymore whether they're absolutely definitely for independence, but they're for independence for women, not just Women for Independence.
Right.
And I think the independence for women angle is one that will be pushing over the next 18 months to 2 years.
And this is what impressed. I mean, these Syrian women were taken to the Parliament. They've met various groups, you know, during their visit here, and they've actually, you know, come from a society where you had a dictatorship. You still have Assad's still in power. You know, women were never at the table. You know, in principle, they were just there in the background. And they came here and they see a society and a parliament and a government that places an emphasis on women's role within that, an equal role within that. And you know, that's given them, as the Mistura said, it's given them incredible kind of confidence and hope that, you know, these things are possible. You know?
Well, I think the other thing to note is that in the Holyrood election, Women for India had 14 candidates. Women who had never been engaged in politics before became engaged as a result of Women for Independence and the referendum. And we now have 3 MSPs from Women for Independence, and I think what we will see is when, you know, Jean was on last week, she was talking about doing politics differently and different behaviours, and I think we will start to see more of that reflected within Holyrood.
In your article, one of the things that they were talking about the fact that obviously our first ministers are women, our 2 opposition leaders are women. What did the sense you get of Syrian women and how they kind of reacted to that? Did you feel that was giving them some inspiration?
Well, there's no doubt about it, you know, and I mean, as he was saying, you know, even as Mistura was saying, even at the highest level, I mean, these women act as a kind of almost a conduit, if you like. They're his eyes and ears amongst a network of Syrian women on the ground, living daily with the horrors that are going on in places like Damascus, Homs, or Aleppo, or whatever. So they're feeding them that information. But he genuinely believes that when there's a sufficient kind of momentum within the peace talks, that he wants to bring in what he called the DNA of these women in terms of the peace work, and bring them right into the centre, into the direct talks themselves, you know. Because, you know, we're talking about a society that even before the war here, women, Syrian society where women were not particularly well represented. There were women in government, but they keep quiet, sit in the corner, don't say too much, and if you stepped out of line, you know, your knuckles were wrapped, you know. So this is you know, strangely liberating. It's an odd thing to say at a time when the country's going through such a hellish time, but, you know, when peace returns to Syria, it's small roots and foundations like that, I think, that are going to be crucial for the rebuilding of the country. And that's something, you know, we in the West do. We were talking about Blair. We're fantastic about going into places like Libya, fantastic about going into places like Iraq or Syria. We never think about the long game, that some
Very good at leaving them early.
we leave them early, and we don't look at the rebuilding process. And then lo and behold, we get very surprised when IS step into the breach and exploit the turmoil that's going on. So, you know, at the very least, this is long-term thinking.
I hesitate to move from Syria to the Eurovision Song Contest, but fearlessly, I'm going to. Because
There's
obviously...
heavy politics there, isn't there?
Exactly, that's what I was going to try and say. And that although it's a cheese fest in many ways, and there's a debate to be had about how good musically any of the songs are, as in they're all rubbish, but nevertheless there are political undercurrents to that, and never more so than the one which took place yesterday.
Well, number one, I have to confess, I didn't see it last night. I didn't even know who'd won till this morning. And I was told, and I realised, although immediately with Ukraine, you know, and the implications that would have politically. I've been in eastern Ukraine, as you know, on a number of occasions during the war, and in Kiev, and you know the country is very beleaguered and very downbeat at the moment. I mean, this war rumbles on in the east of the country, and there's all kinds of kind of nasty politics around as well, nationalist politics and, you know, pro-Moscow issues and goodness knows what. But at the very least, on a light note, I think this will be something at least will be a bit more upbeat for the country. You know,
it's not the most upbeat of songs, I think it's first line is they're all coming to kill us now.
Really? Well, I did gather that there was some kind of political... Well, it would be difficult, actually, I think, for a country like Ukraine at this precise point in time. You know, how do you live with a war on your doorstep and ignore it? It percolates, it filters into every aspect of life, even into the Eurovision Song Contest in that way.
And I think it was the lyrics that appealed more than the song itself. The song,
well, as I say, I
great,
haven't, you know, so I could possibly call it past sort of any aesthetic or creative sort of you know, opinion on it.
I didn't see it last night either. I was washing my hair. You've got to get your priorities right, haven't
Me
you?
too.
Well, I was delighted Australia take part because I've seen earlier
That
on
puzzled me.
our mobile phone roaming charges are going to be so much less now when we go to Australia.
Well, you know, as someone who spent 30 years of life covering foreign affairs, I have to say I was thrown by the participation of Australia in the Eurovision Song Contest. But I've now been duly told that, you know, they are honorary Europeans or something like that. Is that?
Which is fantastic while people in Britain are trying to leave.
Yes, very, very
Bit of
curious.
a paradox there.
Yes, but they were allowed this status last year, and it's just continued. But
and
I
they've
think
come back for more.
I think so. But nobody's looked to the Eurovision Song Contest for logic. It just
I also think
exists in a universe.
Well, given the history, the creation of Australia, I mean, as a country and its history, you know, I just think that whole relationship with Europe and the fact that they've been given this honorary European status.
I think
there's a touch of irony there as well.
It's a tremendous incentive for people like Richard who can't sing when you look at some of the contestants. There is a stage here for you, Richard. Eurovision next year.
Next year, that's it.
I'm never going to be in the Eurovision Song Contest.
Well, I don't know, I heard it one year.
Although you were saying that it wasn't a great song, I mean, Britain...
Third last again, I think.
Third last.
Oh, was it? Really?
Yeah,
Yeah, but it wasn't, to be fair.
Is that not an improvement though in recent years?
possibly.
Possibly. But then Putin was going all out to win this contest.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's a song contest, but he took it incredibly seriously.
Well, I mean, there's nothing that Vladimir Putin doesn't take seriously at the moment, let's be honest about it. I mean, he is an absolute master of the whole propaganda issue. I mean, you know, whatever you think of Putin, whatever you think of Russia's politics and its role in Syria and whatever, you know, they've constantly outmaneuvered and outstepped the West. I mean, from Putin's perspective, when it comes to international diplomacy and looking as though they're doing something and being proactive when, you know, the West sits on its hands over places like Syria.
I think domestically it was a blinder as well because my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law all think he's wonderful. And they all think we in the West are
Well, I know
trying
you're married to a
change
Russian,
their life.
but I mean,
Yeah.
to be fair, there is a huge sort of section of Russian society who think he's not so much wonderful as absolutely abhorrent as well. You know, and you know, the man has as many detractors as he has supporters, and I think it's important to understand that.
Gets
That's
booed.
good.
Russia gets booed every year at the Eurovision Song Contest, mainly I think because of its homophobic attitudes and its very terrible treatment of homosexuals. But he's very unpopular for all sorts of reasons. But
Unpopular in some
Unpopular.
amongst a certain community, particularly in Russia as well.
I think it's more, my experience is it's very limited compared to yours. I'm only in Russia once a year, every couple of years. Is that the poorest people still have this thing about the Russian pride, like the Americans, the poorest American still thinks of the American dream. The Russian people still think of the Russian bear and being great.
But the terrible thing is that, you know, while Putin has exploited that ruthlessly and endlessly, you know, conjuring up the great Soviet thing. I mean, you know, the Russia of today is about as far removed from that Soviet era as you could possibly get. I mean, it's a place of oligarchs as well. It's capitalism itself overtook the place. The oligarchs run stuff. It's riddled with criminality and corruption and stuff like that. I'm not suggesting that the Soviet era was necessarily any better, but constantly drawing parallels between these two periods. But Putin does it masterfully, and it taps in. I mean, I think in a way, we were talking earlier on about Trump, and Boris and stuff like that. There's an element of that populist element that Putin has, that he's able to put his finger on the pulse of a whole section of his population, and it works politically.
I don't know if I might be misreading him, but I think he's also got something they don't have. He's got the fear element, because they do think he's the guy who'll get on, ride bareback on a horse, and get off and take someone on. He's got that personal stature, but at least with the family that I have in Russia, they think he's a man of action rather than a politician.
He certainly is that. Yeah.
Well, everybody's terrified. Well, been terrified of Putin. Everybody's terrified of Trump as well, because they think they actually might stand some chance of winning, which is a very frightening thought.
Well, I've consistently over the last few weeks here, and I'm talking to fellow correspondents and people involved in foreign affairs, and I don't know whether it's just wishful thinking in their behalf, or whether they're just trying to blot out the prospect of a Trump presidency, but they're still not convinced that he will actually be able to, chest the tape and make it all the way, and I personally still feel that. I mentioned the other week there that the women's vote, the Hispanic vote, the black vote. I mean, he has to carry these communities with him in order to go all the way, and he's not likely to do that. I mentioned Florida last week, for example, which, I think it was 1924, as I said, was the last time an American president was appointed without winning Florida, Calvin Coolidge. He has to win there, and it's unlikely that he will.
Are comedians not praying that he wins? Well, it's going to be a lot funny. It's going to be a lot more material.
Well, the problem is, as soon as he gets in, you're accused of being hacked if you make jokes about it.
Yeah, well, exactly. You could be lined up and shot.
If you weren't funny.
I've got a really good friend who's hoping he does win, and he's going to move to America, but he's a bricklayer.
What is the wall building going on there? Yeah.
When I was in Canada last year, it was one of the other candidates who didn't get any. Was talking building a wall between Canada and America, and with the one in Mexico, you just put a roof on and keep the American.
Well, I mean, we were talking Trump and Putin. Can you imagine if he was president, sitting down
and Boris intervening,
and the Trump Putin encounter? I mean, it just does not. It's in the realms of madness, really, isn't it?
We were talking earlier about Question Time last week.
Oh.
Did you see it? Last week, you said it was the worst one you'd ever seen.
I wish I had washed my hair. It was dreadful. The quality of the contribution from the panellists was appalling. There was very little good information given out. Dimbleby was woeful as an independent arbitrator
his introduction
of discussion.
to the question about named persons was
almost
misleading.
fraudulent. It was almost fraudulent to take an audience paid for by the taxpayer, an opportunity to talk to millions of people, and to blatantly misinform people. I think is scandalous. But
I think the named persons legislation is so misunderstood, so widely misunderstood that it kind of demands a TV programme all by itself, I think, which we need to do at some point.
We will.
I think we should
when you're ready to name your guests, you might get a bit of flack over that, having a guest show.
No doubt. But no, that's good. Thank you very much, both of you, for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this week's show, which was our sixth. Time flies.
It does.
And we're going to end tonight's show with another song by Ewan McElvany.
Yep. It's a cover
version.
Patience of Angels, originally by Boo Howardine, but also you might know the version sung by Eddie Reader. We're about to hear the version from Ewan McElvany.
Ewan.
Thank you.
From the top of the bus, she thought she saw him wave. She saw Tuesdays and forgetfulness and a little money saved. Where to go, she don't know, but from here I can tell that it would try the patience of angels. It would try the patience of angels. Angels. And you know something's wrong when the morning hurts your eyes and the baby won't stop crying. You'll be waiting till you die. Would I be any good if I was what I faint? It would try the patience of angels. It would try the patience of angels. Angels. There's a door in a wall, in a house, in a street, in a town where no one knows her name. There's a door in a wall, in a house, in a street, in a town where no one knows her name. She's the patience of angels. It would try the patience of angels. It would try the patience of angels. Angels.
Thank you.